Hello. Today for you I have solved the famous interview question FizzBuzz in 25 different programming languages. You might ask, why? And the answer is, I don't know. Maybe boredom, or maybe for fun. But I think that it does give somewhat of a syntactical foundation in a lot of different languages. So overall, good exercise. So, for those of you who don't know what FizzBuzz is, it is a famous interview question commonly used, or at least it used to be commonly used by many tech companies as a way to throw off their interviewees because of how simple it is. It's like when chefs will hire a chef, they'll ask them to make an omelet, which is a trivial task for a good chef. But the point is, like, can you do such a simple thing just off the cusp, you know? So FizzBuzz is you're given an integer n as an input, and you have to loop from n to 0 and print fizz if n is a multiple of 3, buzz if n is a multiple of 5, and fizzbuzz if n is a multiple of both 3 and 5. So the output for this program, if done correctly, it would be 1, 2, fizz, because fizz, 3 is a multiple of 3, and then 4, buzz, fizz, 7, 8, fizz, buzz, 11, fizz, 13, 14, fizz, buzz. And this would be a correct answer if n was 15, because you can see it went through 0 to 15. The first language that I will show off is Python, the Python solution. Keep in mind that I'm using the most basic, naive solution of each of these simply because it would have taken far too much time to solve each of them with a complex and nuanced solution using the language's features. So most of these solutions should look pretty familiar to you. I think a lot of people know Python, so it's pretty simple. Function FizzBuzz takes x, loops I through x. If I mod 5 is equal to 0 and I mod 3, FizzBuzz, so on and so forth. I'm not going to dwell too long on most of these because there's a lot to cover. Next, we have a very similar language with a similar solution, Ruby, another scripting language. It's very simple. It differs in Python a little bit because it doesn't use the same tab. Our next language is Lua. Lua is extremely similar to Ruby. It uses all but the same syntax for most of it. You will notice the for loops work a little bit differently. Lua for loops look a little bit more like C-style for loops, but other than that, pretty much the exact same thing. This is the crystal solution. Now you'll notice here things get a little bit more interesting. Not necessarily with the syntax. I think that crystal syntax is basically the same as Ruby's, but that's how it was designed. The interesting thing about crystal is that crystal is pretty much as fast as C, or at least it's supposed to be, which you'll look at the syntax and you go, wow, how is that possible? Well, crystal is very new, and it just recently hit its 1.0, I think. So it's a very new and innovative language that tries to merge the high-level, beautiful syntax of Ruby with the low-level speed of C, which I think is a very cool combination. Continuing with the super high-level language, scripting language-ish trend that we're going with here, we have Bash. Now, if you've used any sort of Linux shell, you've used Bash before. Bash is a scripting language that is mostly used for terminal, like it's usually used as kind of like a glue for other languages. Rarely is it ever used for its entire projects by itself, but you'll notice here that it's a little bit different from some of the other ones. The for loops are entirely different. They work pretty much the same. It's just you'll see so how it takes an argument. So you see at the bottom how I've called the FizzBuzz function with 100, which is our input variable. How we get that number is it's not taken at the top with the function. It's actually taken in the $1, which is, the first argument for the function, which is kind of an interesting way of doing things. So that just loops through it, and then the rest of it's pretty similar. $sign before each call to a variable. Yeah. Here's one I doubt a lot of people have used or even ever heard of is Nim. It's another scripting language, and I would say it's quite similar to Python in a lot of ways. But the syntax is a little bit different. So you can see this is the first language that uses proc as its function declaration call. Proc for process. You can see that it's typed, or statically typed, unlike a lot of other scripting languages that are dynamically typed, such as Python or Ruby. You can see the for loop syntax is very reminiscent of something like Rust, where it uses the two dots and then the other one. You'll see a few other languages do it like that, but yet it also uses the same indent style code like Python. Overall, I think Nim is a pretty cool language. Probably it will see more use as time goes on. Here we have R. R is a data science programming language. That's what it's primarily used for. You can see the syntax is pretty similar to the other scripting languages. The function calls, the function definitions, they differ a little bit. As you can see, the name and then the arrow to the function, which is not super different. I think they've just moved it around a little bit. But other than that, it's basically the same as the other scripting languages. I believe R has concluded our scripting languages. So we're going to move on to C-style languages, starting with Java. Java is kind of the epitome of an object-oriented programming language. As you can see, in Java, you have a class declaration, and all of your code goes inside of a main class. You can create other classes, but for this, super simple. So, as you can see, main class, we have our num for number of repeats, C-style for loops. You're going to see those a lot in the coming ones. And yeah, it's pretty simple, pretty much same logic as the other ones. It's just it uses classes and methods rather than functions. In a very, very similar vein to Java, we have C#. Now you'll notice that these are pretty much the exact same solution, and that is why C# is commonly referred to as Microsoft Java, because they basically copied Java's syntax. It's all but the same. Yeah, I have nothing more to say about this. Next we have C and C++. Now, I did both of these at the same time because they are almost the same. The print statements are different in C++ compared to C. Other than that, it's pretty much the same thing. There's no difference. I thought I would just put them on the same slide. Here we have Dart. Now, we're not quite done with C-style languages yet. Dart is probably one of our last ones, but you are going to see the C-style influence throughout pretty much every single language on this list, just because of how influential C was, the mother of all programming languages. So you can see the influence very clear here. I mean, Dart is practically C. Well, not, it's probably more similar to Java just because it's higher level. But yeah, you can see the C-style for loops, the semicolons in between to differentiate between the sections, the incrementer, the void before the name of the function, so to declare the return type. This is all pretty much the exact same thing as Java, C, C#, C++. These are like the real C copies that I'm going through right now. Branching off a little bit from the C-style syntax, we have Swift, Apple's programming language that they developed for app development on iOS and macOS devices. Swift is a simple, elegant language, and it definitely has a lot of use cases, especially when it comes to app development. Overall, I think it's nice looking. You can see the use of non-C style for loops, which in my opinion is a welcome change that you're going to see in the next few languages. See, it goes basically kind of similar to how Python for loops work, I in range of 0 through n. And that's, I think, how for loops should be written. It's a repeat until statement. Other than that, I think it's pretty similar. It looks nice, fun to write, good language. This is the Go programming language developed by Google to solve an in-house problem, but then it kind of grew and became a little bit more popular among developers outside of Google. Today, Go is a pretty popular language used by a lot of people. It was kind of developed as a bit of a new C in a way. I think it's definitely a bit higher level than C because it has garbage collection, but it's not totally different from C either. It just really aims to fix some of the problems present in C to give it kind of a new, refreshed look. And I think they succeeded. Go is a nice, pleasant programming language to write with. Overall, I think that it's pretty good. And you'll see with the next one, there's often somewhat of a rivalry between Go and the next programming language that I'll go over. They're constantly debated, and I can't quite figure out why. And the next language is Rust. Rust is a personal favorite of mine. It was developed by Mozilla in an attempt, I think, to provide safety to their web environments, but Rust is extremely fast. It's almost as fast as C, if not faster in certain cases, and it was definitely developed in a way to solve the flaws of C and C++, and certainly, like, specifically to replace C++ in a lot of instances. Rust's primary feature is the borrowing system. Basically, it introduces the idea of having ownership of memory and variables. So when you declare a variable, it's owned by that function, and to give it to other functions, you can borrow it out to them, so other functions can borrow it rather than just copying the value entirely, which is very efficient, and it also creates memory safety. You can see the syntax is elegant and simple. Print line, printing, it's pretty good. The for loops are nice in my opinion because it uses the two dots for through, so 0 through n. Overall, I think it's a very elegant language, has a bright future ahead for it. Here we have Kotlin, a language developed on the JVM as a way to, I think, replace Java in Android app development specifically. Google has already pretty much fully adopted Kotlin as a standard for writing apps over Java. Kotlin is much newer than Java, the syntax is newer, it's faster, and generally it fixes a lot of the boilerplate issues with Java, a lot of the things people complain about relentlessly when it comes to writing Java code. You can see this solution I have here is probably, I think, the first recursive solution I have shown. So it just calls itself over and over again rather than using a for loop. Moving to a couple Lisp languages, we have Clojure, another language developed on the JVM. Now this is going to look extremely weird to you if you've never seen Lisp or reverse Polish notation in mathematics before. You can see the function declaration, and inside of Lisp, everything is inside of parentheses, which makes parsing really easy, which means Lisp languages have very simple parsers. In fact, this is what Lisp is really famous for, is being very, very simple. Clojure is a little more complex, but I think the interesting thing you can see is the notation in the if statements. You can see the equals n0. The equals comes before, so the operator and then the two things afterwards, which is an interesting way of doing things, and I think you might see it a few more times throughout here, but it's definitely an uncommon way of using mathematical operators and conditional operators. The second Lisp language that I have is Scheme. Scheme is an interesting one. It's specifically popular among certain hobbyists, though it doesn't see a whole lot of use in the real world, I think. Though it definitely does have its fan base and its following, and if you look at the syntax, it's interesting, to say the least. I think it takes a while to get used to. I think if you get into Scheme, I think it can be pretty fun to write, but it was definitely very difficult to learn at first. This is my JavaScript solution. As you can see, it's another solution using recursion rather than looping. It's very simple, very much like most other programming languages. Not really much else to say on that subject. Now, if you thought things were getting a little bit bland before, here's F# to spice things up a little bit. F# is Microsoft's Functional programming language. Yes, that's right. Microsoft wrote a functional programming language. I wouldn't say that it is similar to C# in all that many ways, but it is certainly functional rather than OOP. You can see the let syntax and the equal, and instead of curly braces, and it uses tabs indentation for the for grouping things rather than, well, curly braces once again. You can see the if statements use if-then syntax, so if this, then do this, which is interesting, and there's no sort of parentheses, curly braces, pretty much anywhere, which is certainly interesting, but the solution is small because of the way that it's laid out, because there's no curly brackets. It makes the solution very small, and I think F# is a pretty elegant language overall. Now let's move to the opposite of two extremes. Last language was F#. This is TCL. TCL has so many curly braces. F# doesn't have any. I mean, just look at this. Curly braces in the function declaration, curly braces for bodies, curly braces on each separate piece of the for loop, and they use C-style for loops here, so there's 3 sections rather than separating by semicolons, which is what a lot of languages do. They separate theirs with curly braces, and guess what? More curly braces in the body, and if statements entirely curly braces. It's actually insane, and you definitely don't have to put this all in one line, but I thought that it was kind of an interesting showing of how TCL lets you do that without any problems. It's kind of interesting. But yeah, lots and lots of curly braces. Except for, oddly enough, when you're calling a function, no curly braces. Consistency much? Now, as we move into some of the more esoteric programming languages, we have BASIC, which was definitely popular 40, 50 years ago. It's not used now, though it is still used in select use cases like calculators. A lot of calculators still run BASIC. Other than that, the syntax is very simple. It's just, yeah, I mean, simple. It's readable. Like, I think anyone could read through this and probably understand what it's doing just because it's quite verbose. You'll notice that everything is in capitals. I don't think you have to do that anymore, but it is the standard for writing things in BASIC. I'm also using Qbasic to run this. There's a lot of different ways to run BASIC just because of how old it is, but Qbasic is what I used for this. Here's another relatively normal one. We have Scala, which, besides from being pretty fun to say, is pretty interesting, I think. Scala is definitely a language where there's a lot to it if you go into it a little bit more. But it's definitely interesting. The for loop syntax is pretty different from a lot of other ones, using the arrow to assign 1 to the I, which is different from other languages, but not too different. Def for function declarations, define, much like Python. And then the if-else statements is weird because you can put the body of the if statement on the same line, which definitely tightened up the solution and made it a lot smaller. And I think it looks pretty nice. Definitely an interesting language. This will probably be the last normal language that I go through today. We have CoffeeScript. Now, despite CoffeeScript being developed by one guy in JavaScript, it has picked up quite a following, I think. It's somewhat popular, especially for a language developed by a solo developer, and I think that it is just meant to be a more simple JavaScript. As you can see, the lambda syntax at the top using the arrow and the equal sign. We have while loops. Yeah, nothing too crazy about that. But yeah, I think it's just a nice, elegant looking, simpler JavaScript. Now everyone say hello to Raku, and thank you, Raku, for bringing us officially into weird territory. You're going to notice a lot of weird things about the Raku syntax, and this was certainly an interesting one to learn. We have sub to denote the functions, which is totally different, never seen that one before. We have loop for our for loops. That's right, they couldn't use for, they used loop. And you can see that it is actually normal C-style for loops that they're using right here, which is definitely interesting. I'm not sure why that they used loop instead of for, but they did. You can see the use of the keyword my. That is also definitely a weird thing. Now, you come down a little bit, you'll see given. Now, I didn't use if statements here, I used given I. So this is essentially a switch case statement. So you have, or not a switch case statement, it's probably more similar to pattern matching actually. But yeah, given the variable I, which variables are called with the $sign, much like Perl. So given I, and then your conditions basically. So when I mod 15 is 0, say FizzBuzz. And I actually like this a lot. I think that this is a very nice looking solution, and it makes like having big if-else blocks, it makes them look a lot more elegant, having a default statement as well. I really think that that Raku is kind of a cool language, but it's definitely a little bit out there. The final language that I'm going to cover here that I've written FizzBuzz in is Forth, which is a personal favorite of mine. On my channel, I have a whole series on learning Forth, if you're ever interested. Forth is an old language that isn't really used too much anymore, though it has seen a lot of use. Most notably, NASA has used it in their rockets and arms, which is very cool. Forth is weird because it's stack oriented, which means that all of your variables and data and your values, they're all going to go onto the stack, which is just somewhere where data is stored basically. And then your operations come afterwards, which means it uses reverse Polish notation, sort of similar to Lisp languages like Clojure, which we covered earlier. If you look here, we have, looking at the stack-based thing, we have 101, 1, so 101 puts 101 on the stack, and then a 1 on the stack, and then do is the for loop notation, so it's going to loop until 1 is equal to 101, and then the loop at the bottom tells it when the loop is over, and it just keeps looping through that. And you can see that pattern continues throughout this whole thing, and I really think Forth is quite elegant syntax for something so old, and people have described it as like a cross between assembly and Python, which I think is quite accurate. Yeah, definitely super cool. You should definitely go learn it because it is definitely one of the most important programming languages. Okay, so that was 25 programming languages in which I have written FizzBuzz. There are a few more in my GitHub repo that I decided not to go over. For example, APL, which is just, I mean, it's a whole nother level. I think it would take me forever to even explain how that worked, and I mean, it was just better to leave it out. And a few others that I could have added, but decided not to just because this video is already too long. If you would like to contribute to the GitHub repo, it's in the description. You can go and submit a pull request if you want. Other than that, that ends this video. I hope you enjoyed.